The subject of this film theme discussion is: do we still need film censorship in our modern society? And I'm going to be reading passages from the three things today. This book of Life magazine. This book of Life magazine, and an article from around about the same from 1969. These articles are all from around about the same time, 1969, 1970. That's bound volume of the Weight magazines from 1969. And I've already showed you the front cover of that, haven't I? This is there's an article here called the Permissive Society. A phenomenon that characterised the 1960s was the permissive sex behaviour of young people, but there is far more to this permissive sex society than that. Sex and the moral attitudes that people adopt towards sex have always been a basic element in setting social standards, but the 1960s saw the explosion of what was varyingly seen as a crisis, a revolution in natural social evolution, the emergence, or perhaps the establishment, of what has come to be conveniently called the permissive society. And there's, in this very same article, there's a passage later on censorship, and the experience of Great Britain proved to be the experience of the world. In the United States, censorship, never theoretically allowed, was fast disappearing for all practical purposes too. Small cinemas showed nothing but pornographic sex films, and obscene magazines and books flourished. A ban was imposed on the Swedish sex film I'm Curious Yellow when it was seized by the customs. It became a core celebrity and was eventually allowed to be shown. There is now virtually no cinema censorship in the States, especially in New York. In the Scandinavian countries, censorship is also disappearing, and in Denmark, where it has been abolished altogether, there are reports of a drop in sex crimes and other encouraging signs that freely available pornography is not necessarily harmful. It is from Scandinavia's pioneering work towards legalised permissiveness that suggests a more socially desirable environment may be the result of a permissive society and not, as some suggest, disaster. Well, there's another article in here. Right. This is another book of Life magazine. There's an article here called Grundy Our Guardian. The hypocrisy of Victorian censorship was embodied in the fictitious Mrs. Grundy. Modern society is much more permissive, but do we still need moral guardians? But Plato, the ancient Greek philosopher, thought he had found the answer to the problem of censorship. His ideal society will be governed by guardians who will look after the morals. Welfare and education for citizens. But apart from the fact that this authoritarian solution will not be acceptable in the Western world of today, there is another difficulty: the question of who will be the guardians of the guardians. Thus, there are two separate questions. Firstly, is there a necessity for censorship? Secondly, who should be the censors? I'm going to read a bit more of it. There are four main communication media: films, television and radio, theatre and printed matter. Particularly books and newspapers, all with their own problems. By and large, the film industry censors itself, though most countries have some form of outside body which exerts political and moral pressure. In America, for example, although the film industry works to its own very liberal written code of what is and what is not allowed on the screen, such organisations as the League of Catholic Decency exert by far the most pressure. The film companies have found it impossible to get a film shown coast to coast without its seal of approval. In Britain, however, there is a central board of censors. This was set up after a law about fire regulations was interpreted by the courts to allow local councils to control exactly which films were shown. This proved so unworkable that a central board was set up which controlled both the political and the moral content of the films. Some of their cuts seem ludicrous today. In the 1930s, for example, films which hold up British officers and civilians in odious light as regards their conduct in India were banned. But the dangers of political censorship are well illustrated by the board's banning of anti-Nazi films just before the Second World War. In the 1950s and 1960s, however, the board has restricted itself to cutting films only on moral grounds, and year by year it is becoming more permissive. Denmark is the only country which has totally abolished censorship of any form with regard to the making of films, and the only restriction on the showing of the films is that they should have some form of artistic merit or be shown in clubs. An interesting sidelight on this new law is that the majority of films produced are for export, particularly to Germany and Britain. Unfortunately, there are no figures to show how this new attitude has affected the Danish population as a whole. Read a bit more. Television, and to a lesser extent radio, is a special case in the communications field, in that the material is received passively by the audience. With books, films and the theatre, people have to make an effort to be entertained, while in most homes the television is on, regardless of what is pouring out of it. An American presidential report published in 1969 by the National Commission on the Causes and Prevention of Violence stated, "Violence on television encourages violent forms of behaviour and fosters moral and social values about violence in daily life which are unacceptable in civilised society." There's been a great deal of controversy about the need for some sort of supervision over the programme content, and this is the first report to come out heavily on the side of censorship. In America, of course, there is the unofficial censorship exerted by advertising sponsors of the programmes. On one occasion, the singer Petula Clark kissed the Negro singer Harry Belafonte on the cheek, and the sequence was cut on the demand of the sponsors. Whenever censorship is lifted in a country, it tends to be removed first from the theatre. This is probably because of the restricted size of the audience and its tendency to be more discriminating. Nudity is now commonplace on the stage. Is now such a commonplace on the stage that the Actors Union has laid down a set of rules to be followed by theatre managements at auditions. Right, well, we've learned quite a bit from that article, haven't we? Well, it mentions that Denmark was the only country that had totally abolished censorship of any form with regard to the making of films. And in the early 80s, when home video recorders were starting to become popular, there was actually a film smuggled through customs, which one of my Facebook friends has described as vile, and it was smuggled through the customs from Denmark. And the TV series, the Dark Side of Porn, featured a documentary about this film that had been smuggled through through the customs from Denmark. I don't know if they made any. I might have made a couple of 1 or 2 mistakes. It was smuggled into Britain through our customs from Denmark, and it features repeated and explicit scenes of bestiality, which is which, as many of you will know, is copulation with animals. And one of my Facebook friends has seen it, and she describes it as vile. And this film, it's commonly known as Animal Farm. But I mean, there was no law against having intercourse with animals in Denmark up until 2015. So I don't know what, I'm not exactly sure what their stance is on animal pornography now. And I know I know they passed a law banning child pornography in 1980 in Denmark. But they don't have a system. They don't have the same censorship system as what we do. They don't have a film censorship. They don't have a system where films have to be censored before they're shown in public cinemas like we do. They've abolished that. They don't have anything like that. They never have had since 1969. What right. Right, there's an article in the Awake magazine of July the 22nd, from July the 22nd, 1969. Motion pictures explode with sex and violence. Have you noticed what has happened to motion pictures lately? In the last few years, there has been an explosion of films featuring adultery, fornication, lesbianism, homosexuality, violence, and mass killing. If you look at movie advertisements in newspapers now, you will be struck by their almost pornographic tone. On just one day, some headlines among the 8 pages of motion picture advertisements in a leading conservative newspaper ran as follows, each for a different film. One of the most immoral, one of the most subversive movies you will see this year. A lesbian affair, torrid, clawing, backbiting. The wackiest, sexiest film yet. Eerie and erotic. This is strong stuff, it's not for the timid or the straight-laced. A landmark likely to permanently shatter many of our last remaining movie conventions. On the same day, another newspaper that carried many of these same advertisements added one that said, where wife swapping and minor orgying is just swell. Some theatres show nothing but this type of film. The New York Times reported 18 months ago New York City had 10 theatres that showed sex violence films on the 7 days a week policy. All were clustered on or near 42nd Street and Times Square. Today, 25 full-time sex violence theatres are scattered throughout the city. There have, however, been 2 significant changes in the films themselves. Now, more often than not, the contents go much further than ever before in living up to the promises of nudity, but violence and perversion held out in the titles. Commenting on this trend, Look magazine noted, "The films we are getting, and that are to come, have no holds barred as far as sex and violence and language go." The same trend is taking place throughout the world. From Finland, our awake correspondent reports, Dr. Jerker A. Eriksson of a government censorship board said, "What today is unbelievable, not to say horrifying, is tomorrow quite natural. In the sex market, a liberal and more courageous course will be chosen." One correspondent adds, "Some films even show sexual intercourse and are absolutely pornographic." Advertisements in Finnish newspapers read, "The triumphal victory of immorality, inexhaustible, expressive sex, would unrestrained, undisciplined, and uninhibited be to your taste." Why so many new films on sex and violence now? One reason analysts give has to do with the impact that the advent of television had. Millions of people began staying at home to watch the entertainment on their TV sets. The old expression, "let's go to a movie," was replaced by "turn on the TV." As a result, hundreds of motion picture theatres went out of business. Faced with this sharp competition, the motion picture industry turned to new things such as the widescreen and stereo sound. The next step was to make the films bolder, the scenes more sexual and violent. But why highlight sex and violence? The Des Moines, Iowa Sunday Register comments, "Movies with a condemned rating always seem to draw bigger crowds than the family-type pictures," said a Dubuque theatre manager. "Pictures filled with violence and sex, that seems to be what they want today," said M.J. Bretagne, general manager of a Grand and Strand theatres here. "Films are produced to make money. Whatever sells is what the industry will produce, and what sells today is sex and violence, drawing people into theatres. Hence, this is given as a main reason for the onslaught of these films." However, there is another reason for all this, and it is far, far more significant than any other reason. But before analysing it, let us take a close look at what many of these new films contain. Also, is there really any harm in them? How do they affect people, especially youths? And in view of a trend, what can you do about it? Well,